Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops, number 22 of Series 8. The question for the day is, what is mind or consciousness, and how can it inform a philosophy of life? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 6, Section 1. In these workshops, we have been defining consciousness ostensibly by discussing its many aspects. So today we will finally define mind and consciousness explicitly. But mind or consciousness cannot be defined or understood just like some other object in the world. This is because of its character, its status, and the nature of any kind of comprehensive understanding. That is, comprehensive understanding requires context as well as multiple features and approaches. And the status of consciousness as a fundamental entity also requires special attention. And the same can be said of matter. John Locke said, for example, "What is matter? I know not what." Schopenhauer answered that we can know matter through our bodies that are matter. The point is that these general categories of mind and matter are difficult to understand, and that simple single sentence definitions cannot be given. We've also seen particular problems like the self-obfuscation of consciousness. Yet some initial clarifications can be given, such as John Searle's provisional definition, that consciousness is all the mental states that we are conscious of, which is a starting point that corrects some misapprehensions, such as consciousness isn't a transcendental entity, but is an amalgam of mental states. Yet they all have a unity of sharing the same physical and bodily space in space and time. Yet the character of consciousness is contentious as well as complex. I've outlined many different theories of consciousness, and understanding requires engaging with them. These theories, like physicalism, behaviorism, and functionalism, employ different methods of understanding. Functionalism, for example, understands consciousness in terms of what it does or what it is for. But this approach is prone to bias and doesn't tell us what consciousness is, nor its ramifications. So in general, I have adopted a phenomenological and structural account of consciousness. These are structures like graduation and intentionality, leading to features such as process and relation. Last week we discussed origins of mind, ending with an interactionist theory of mind and matter. Considerations such as these have resulted in my own theory of mind and consciousness. This is an interactionist theory of mind and a structural account of consciousness as a process or relation. I have argued for this position in the course of these workshops and will do so again later here. Yet this definition raises the question of a distinction between mind and consciousness, often used interchangeably. Broadly speaking, mind can include every aspect of mental life, like the unconscious and animal minds. And like Searle, we can provisionally define consciousness as all the mental states that we experience. We must also distinguish between consciousness and typically human reflective consciousness or self-consciousness. Immediate consciousness is also widely experienced by humans as well as by other animals. And of course, in my view, the physical brain can be distinguished from both mind and consciousness. There are also many theories and ways of understanding mind, of which we will shortly outline a few, such as dualism, physicalism, monism, externalism, pluralism, panpsychism, and panpsychism, as well as functionalism and behaviourism. We should also note three different questions that are often conflated and hidden in theories of mind. 1. What is the ontological status of mind as either physical or mental? This is asked in analytic philosophy. 2. What are the preconditions of mind, such as neurological preconditions that are often asked about the mind itself? And 3. The question, what is the character of mind? And this is my main objective here. Yet understanding the mind and consciousness has implications for every aspect of philosophy, as spelling these out does at least two things. They show the significance of mind and consciousness, as well as giving a functional definition. Yet theory of mind has implications for questions of life, as well as for academic questions like the mind-body identity problem. Is mind a refined aspect of matter, or is it another species of being? Or 2, on the question of personal identity, who am I, or what kind of beings are we? And 3, what are values? Are they mental states or aspects of the world, and what are their origins? The first way of understanding or theory of mind that we should look at is dualism. Dualism is the default distinction between the physical world and mind, often described as spirit or soul. Descartes is the primary advocate of a philosophical version of dualism. He characterized mind by rationality, transparency, indivisibility, and non-extension. But both these properties themselves and the Cartesian relation of mind to the world have been widely rejected. This is partly because Descartes took the notions of rationality and mind as substance from Renaissance science. Transparency is refuted by the presence of the unconscious, and indivisibility by split brain and other discoveries. And in my view, although mind may not be extendable in space, it is subject to graduation. So when reversed as opposites, Descartes' properties begin to provide certain features of mind. And with phenomenology, such features can begin to be described as structures. And Husserl said that Descartes opened the door to consciousness but didn't go in. Yet the widespread rejection of Cartesian dualism led to the supposedly more scientific view of physicalism. That is, mind and matter are composed of the same physical stuff, of which mind is an extremely refined kind. Physicalism, materialism, physical monism, and mind-body identity theory are of this same view. Although intuitively unattractive, physicalism is dominant in analytic philosophy. Yet there are some tacit forms of physicalism, such as describing mind or consciousness as energy. These three main arguments can be cited for physicalism. 1. Despite appearances, dualist perceptions are mistaken and see one thing as two, for example, the morning and the evening stars. 2. The coherence of science requires unity under the same principles without ontological disjunctions. And 3. Science and neurology can provide a detailed explanation of mind as an aspect of the physical world. Without replying to these arguments, an argument against them can be found just in the existence of alternatives to physicalism and dualism. These alternatives include externalism, pluralism, panpsychism, panpsychism, and these will be discussed shortly. Yet we should also notice a couple of other things that also happen in this discussion. One, it often shifts from discussing mind to consciousness, which reflects a growing appreciation of subjectivity. And two, arguments about properties of consciousness also serve to define consciousness. Saul Kripke, for example, argues against physicalism by distinguishing personal identity as a property of consciousness. That is, personal identity isn't attributable to the physical world, and it is discovered by a priori judgments. Physical identities are discovered contingently in an a posteriori fashion. This distinguishes a unique aspect of consciousness that differentiates it from physicality. Pluralism expands our view of mind with the idea that there aren't just one or two species of being, but many. Karl Popper maintains that there are three species of existence: matter, mind, and its abstract products. Different versions of this view are held by Roger Penrose, Hubert Dreyfus, and Merleau-Ponty. And Thomas Scanlon also speaks of three domains. These are 1, the natural, 2, the mathematical, and 3, the normative, morals, and reasons. Pluralism challenges both the supposed unity of science as well as the categorizations of both dualism and monism. This is because the existence of abstraction raises the question of specific criteria of determination. That is, logical abstractions are a priori, which challenge the a posteriori nature and unity of science. So we can note several consequences or benefits of pluralism. 1, it provides an alternative to or moderates both physicalism and dualism. 2, properties of abstraction argue against physical monism and a unity of science. And 3, abstraction and physicality ontologically flank mind, rendering it more comprehensible. Panpsychism goes further than pluralism to claim that consciousness is everywhere and in everything. Panpsychism is favoured by David Chalmers, Colin Blakemore, Galen Strawson, Whitehead, and others. John Searle calls some outcomes of panpsychism absurd, and I agree that it is seriously flawed. And I regard panpsychism as an indication of the confusion surrounding consciousness. I've argued against panpsychism previously, and I won't be doing so again here, but I can briefly reiterate my argument. This is that consciousness has only been defined with the properties like sentience and cognition, and sentience and cognition are not properties of, nor can be found in, the physical world. So it's illegitimate to describe this supposed property as consciousness. Yet knowing what consciousness is not also helps us to understand what it is. Pan-protopsychism is an alternative to panpsychism, which retains the idea of natural and universal emergence. On pan-protopsychism, mind isn't everywhere, but there is a ubiquitous property that produces mind. The big question here: what is this ubiquitous property? I answered this last week with an interactionist theory to explain the origins of consciousness. And again, knowing the origins of something helps us to understand what it is. Externalism is another quite different view that consciousness is produced by interaction with the external world. Following this thinking, Albert No holds that we have made a category error in misunderstanding mind. That is, understanding mind in terms of brain is like understanding monetary value in terms of metallurgy. now presents mind as a relation, process or interaction between a centre and external objects. Last week we used Georges Bataille's metaphor of mind as water in a bottle to illustrate externalism. Yet we can modify the metaphor to consciousness as a liquid in a container. Here, the walls of the container are the cognitive frameworks which support the shape of the mental liquid. And the liquid in the container can represent mental states of different qualities and viscosities. Numerous thinkers, such as Thomas Metzinger, are developing such a relational and process view of consciousness. For example, Riccardo Manzotti sees externalism going beyond the brain in a process relating to the world. Even theologian Don Cupid sees consciousness as a relation and temporal process. However, externalism implies relations and processes that depend on unexplained structures of consciousness. Yet the phenomenological concept of structure and the relation between them isn't always recognized, but it becomes apparent in the work of Husserl, Heidegger and Sartre. Sartre unrestrainedly names a multiplicity of features as structures. These include freedom, choice, presence, facticity, value, possibility, negation and finitude. But I regard these as features or properties rather than structures because they aren't internally inherent or give shape or form to consciousness. We previously noted the structures of graduation, ephemerality and temporality as characterizations of consciousness. And we listed other structures like intentionality, graduation, insularity and insubstantiality. These aren't preconditions of consciousness, but descriptive features or inherent structures. The structure of divisibility, for example, explains the diversity of the external as a property of consciousness. Sartre does this by making an identification between consciousness and choice as selection. He writes that choice and consciousness are one and the same thing. And he goes on to write, choice isn't just a preference, but a selection traced back to its ontological foundation. But Sartre doesn't actually provide an analysis tracing choice back to its ontological foundation. He can't seem to do this because of his ultra-phenomenological conception of consciousness. But we can fill in by saying that contrast is a form of selection essential to cognition and thereby to consciousness. And we can continue to say that choice expresses contrast and selection. For example, when I look left or right, I affirm what is on my right and negate what is on my left. These are kinds of selection that are essential to epistemic contrasts and perceptions. For example, a white spot on a white board can't be seen. It needs a contrast. The contrasts and selections of an external world are thereby essential to consciousness, and that such contrasts and selections constitute the relational aspect of consciousness. Divisibility opposes the traditional view of the unity of consciousness held by Descartes, Kant and even John Searle. I regard divisibility as a broad structure having application across a whole spectrum of mind. That is, from explaining perception, as above, to modalities of mind and the separateness of individual people. So divisibility applies to people as individual consciousnesses not accepted by some classical views. For Schopenhauer and Feuerbach, for example, consciousness doesn't depend on individuals, they only participate in it. But Bernard Williams and others regard individual separateness as fundamental to modern thought. Yet crucially, divisibility is also applied to the individual mind or consciousness in many ways. For example, in split brains and minds, in schizophrenia, in modes of conscious and the unconscious, and affect or cognition, as well as in every instance of perception and in the production of value. We will see the greater relevance of divisibility to human existence shortly. I gave my view as an interactionist theory of mind and a structural account of consciousness as a process or relation. And consciousness can be seen as a process in at least two ways. One, as a graduated process of development in species as well as in individuals. And two, in Heidegger's view of time and the structure of temporality as the horizon of being. Heidegger's Dasein is a being in the world, or essentially in relation to the world. Searle called this the life world. In this way, Heidegger's Dasein as a being in the world could also be viewed as a form of externalism. And controversially, Hilary Putnam has an externalist interpretation of Aristotle. Yet Heidegger also emphasized that Dasein was in the world of temporality and time. Searle had similarly previously spoken of the flow of consciousness and the flow of becoming, in which every experience has necessarily been preceded in time by experiences. There is here a notion of time as an essential feature of consciousness as an ongoing process. That is, we not only find ourselves in a world of time or temporality, but time is a constituent of consciousness. We find ourselves in a world of time as well as diversity, divisibility, selection and choice. Consciousness is moving through time as well as through diversity in space, and that movement is a developmental process. Temporality explains how we are moving through time and space in a developmental process. The structure of divisibility holds that I can't be you and you can't be me because we are distinct entities. Yet insularity describes this separateness of self-consciousness in another way. And the structure of insularity brings with it a different form of self-apprehension. That is, self-consciousness cannot compare itself to other objects of the same type in the same way. I can compare or contrast myself to physical objects, but these are not objects of the same type as myself. I can compare or contrast myself to other conscious beings, but not in the same way as myself. This is because I apprehend myself directly in a way that I don't apprehend others. And because I cannot compare myself to other objects of the same type in the same way, I apprehend myself in a different way. That is, on the standard model, perception requires contrast and context, like the white spot on a blackboard. But this kind of contrast, context or background is denied to self-consciousness, and this produces a different kind of apprehension that I call attenuated cognition. There are several interesting consequences of attenuated cognition that I want to outline. Firstly, attenuated cognition provides one reason why consciousness is difficult to understand. That is, understanding calls for contextual apprehension in the object in question. But a contextual apprehension of consciousness is problematic. This is because of the singularity that produces attenuated cognition. Secondly, attenuated cognition and insularity explains the characteristic mysteriousness of consciousness. This is because mysteriousness can be explained as a particular mode of apprehension. It is a mode of apprehending consciousness or anything else that lacks context. Other examples of mysterious objects can be given with limited contrast or backgrounds of understanding, such as God, being, the universe, flying saucers, and the totality of things. Thirdly, on a standard account of meaning, self-consciousness should not exist without an ulterior reference. Consciousness should not be able to become self-conscious, but it does become self-conscious. But because self-consciousness does exist, we need a further non-referential account of meaning, and that account is provided by attenuated reference as a product of insularity. There are, of course, arguments both for and against structures of consciousness, but a basic argument for structure is as follows. 1. Consciousness exists. 2. Therefore it must have properties. And 3. Those properties are best described as structures with explanations such as given here. But postmodernists reject both universal structures and a coherent concept of mind that could have structures. Moreover, they claim that structures cannot underlie the whole of human life, but they are directing their attention to the social and psychological structures of Marx and Freud. Yet phenomenologists are instead talking about structures of consciousness, not of psychology or society. And postmodernism has physicalist inclinations which rule out consciousness and thereby structures. And as an argument against physicalism, the above argument for structures can be reversed. 1. We observe structural properties of consciousness. 2. There is an underlying phenomenon producing them that we call consciousness. 3. These are properties of consciousness that cannot be attributed to the physical world. And 4. Therefore, on Leibniz's theory of indiscernibles, consciousness cannot be an aspect of the physical world. Yet in my view, the main argument in favour of a structural account is its power of explanation. In this regard, we have looked at 4 structures of intentionality, divisibility, insularity, and insubstantiality. Intentionality is a relation between internal mental states and external cognitive objects. Intentionality thereby describes the relation between mind and object in externalism. In another context, intentionality explains the significance of objects as a supporting framework, and both intentionality and externalism are illustrated in Bataille's metaphor of water in a bottle. The last explanative feature that I want to outline here is the structure of insubstantiality. Insubstantiality expresses the ephemeral, insular, and divisible or fragmented character of consciousness. Consciousness is subject to diminution, cessation, finitude, dependency, and contingency. It is subject to deformation, loss of capacities, value, or self-esteem. This is because consciousness is nebulous, evanescent, and tenuous. Heidegger and Sartre hold that the being of consciousness is in question. I present this in terms of insubstantiality, and insubstantiality is a result of at least temporality, divisibility, and graduation. Temporality produces impermanence, change, choice, responsibility, and anxiety. Divisibility creates problems like personal fragmentation, internal conflicts, and alienation. Graduation means that we can not only develop but also diminish and eventually die. These structures pose the problems of consciousness in terms of its insubstantiality. Yet insubstantiality can also be illustrated by Sartre's contrast between two forms of being or existence. For Sartre, conscious or subjective being for itself is a kind of nothingness, a lack or desire for being. Physical being in itself is a plenitude or permanence that has independent existence. Here, insubstantiality means that consciousness is precipitously seeking substantiality. In this respect, Sartre is correct in that an insubstantial consciousness is seeking substantiality. But for Sartre, mankind is a useless passion in seeking the permanence of physicality. For Heidegger, the absolute impossibility of existence must be taken up as a possibility of life. But instead of Sartre's useless passion in seeking the permanence of physicality, in my view, a more attainable alternative can be found in pursuing a sufficiency of value. In conclusion, we can repeat both the question, what is consciousness, can't be answered in a single sentence, but a number of features as well as misleading ideas have been outlined. Firstly, despite dualist misapprehensions, we have a first-hand and direct knowledge of consciousness as conscious beings. Secondly, consciousness isn't a kind of substance as Descartes believed. Similarly, physicalism falsely sees consciousness as just a refinement of physicality, and insisting that consciousness is an aspect of the physical world ensures that it won't be understood. The physical world is understood through empirical a posteriori observation. Mathematics is understood through necessary a priori relations. Consciousness must be understood according to its own characteristics. Consciousness has a different mode of existence and must be understood in a different kind of way. That is, for a first-person perspective and a phenomenological observation as well as reason. I myself have argued for an interactive and structural view of consciousness as a relation and process. The feature of relation was explained with the concepts of intentionality and externalism. Process was a feature explained with the concepts of time or temporality. Yet a final caution can be made about the confusion over the character and definition of consciousness. That is, in my view, physicalism, panpsychism and cosmic consciousness are symptoms of this confusion. Next week we'll be starting a new series with an introductory podcast and workshop. So let me have your criticisms or comments at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.